Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I know we have a number of people online. In addition to those of you in the audience, thank you for being here in real live person, which we appreciate more and more. I'm Lise Elliott. I'm a professor of neuroscience and co-chair of the WISH Symposium. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the last of this year's series, which is on gender leadership or women's leadership under the microscope. We began last fall, and I would like to invite those of you who are free in the next hour. We're going to have a reception to celebrate what I can't believe has been 10 years. And I'll have a little more to say about our illustrious history at that time. But I don't want to take any time away from our wonderful speaker, Mabel Abraham, who's joining us from Columbia University Business School. I must shout out to our wonderful advisory panel, who always gives us great advice on our themes and helping select our speakers. And we're hard at work on next year's symposium. And I also, of course, want to thank the people that do the hardest work to put this on, this wonderful organizational team: Amy Hilsey, Brian Rausch, Patty Bender, and our newest member, CJ Collins, along with my co-chairs, Susanna Calkins and Christine Burgess. So today's seminar presented by Mabel Abraham, who is the Barbara and Meyer Feldberg Associate Professor of Business at Columbia Business School in New York, where she co-directs the Equity by Design Lab and does research and teaches on organizational theory. She received her PhD in management from the Sloan School of Management at MIT and was an undergrad math major at Providence College in Rhode Island. Interestingly, between those two stints, she worked at Fidelity Investments as an analyst. So I'm sure that inspired some of her focus on management and business. So she's the author of many publications having to do with gender and leadership, racial inequity, evaluation processes, and promotion and leadership. She's received many awards for her work and scholarship, including most recently the Thinkers 50 Radar List, 30 Thinkers to Watch in 2025. She was a finalist. And in 2024, she was awarded the Russell Sage Foundation Presidential Research Grant for her work on evaluation and gender and race inequity. She's given talks at pretty much all of the superstar business schools: Harvard, Brown, Cornell. She's been here in Chicago at Northwestern, University of Chicago. And so we are very honored to have her grace us with her presentation, Gender Inequality Under the Microscope: Understanding When and How Inequality is Reproduced. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Right. It's always so nice when the folks who invite you out to give a talk give such a glowing overview of what you've done. So I'm basking in that for a moment. So thank you so much for sharing all of that. My name is, in fact, Mabel Abraham. I'm a professor at the business school where I teach a course on power, influence, and networks. I almost said inequality, where a lot of these topics on inequality seep in to a population of students who are going to be future leaders in business. So I spend a lot of my time thinking about how inequality is in fact produced and reproduced, often through evaluative systems. So to get us started, I want you to imagine that we have a man and a woman who are otherwise identical, right? AI helps us generate some very identical images, as you see here. They're both well dressed, but more importantly than that, I'm getting a little bit of feedback. So I'm going to just adjust this for a minute. They have the similar types of credentialing, right? So they went to top universities, they're highly qualified, they performed really well. And what we repeatedly see across different contexts is that they don't experience the same outcomes, right? Their experiences just aren't the same. So what are some of the ways we see this happen? Women continue to earn less than men. Estimates for how big that gap is varies widely, but since we are in fact at a school on medicine and science, I wanted to share some research that has told us that we see these gaps among medical school faculty and at every single rank. So on average, we're seeing gaps of about 8% in the field of medicine. Not only are they not getting paid the same, when we look at their career trajectories, we see that women are not achieving the same levels in leadership, right? They're not getting promoted at the same rates. And again, when we think about STEM and medicine, we see that they're underrepresented across many different leadership roles. So at the end of the day, we see women are comprising about 52% of medical students, but they're still under 34% across different ranks and university positions. So this is something that we see in medicine, we see in business, we see even in fields that are dominated by women, right? So even in nursing, we often see that the idea of the glass escalator that some of you might be familiar with, where we see men who enter into these female-dominated fields still end up ascending much faster than do women, despite it being a traditionally female space. So in the end, we can start with the conclusion that inequality is unfair for the people who experience it. Right? We don't want to be the woman who's being disadvantaged. And we really don't want to be the man who works in the field who knows that our female colleague is being disadvantaged. But it's not even just about the individuals. We also have tons of research that tells us that this inequality creates disadvantages for organizations, right? So we have people who don't have the kind of leadership that brings a full perspective to the table. It means that we have female patients who can't always find a female specialist in a field because women are missing from those spaces. So there are consequences for us as individuals. There are consequences for organizations, not just from a pro-social perspective, but even from a performance or bottom line perspective as well. In my work, I want to sort of lean into understanding why, right? So when I got the invitation that talked about leadership under the microscope, I thought, what a great fit, because a lot of what we need to do is move beyond documenting that these differences exist and really dig in to understand why is it that they exist. Why is it that we continue to see these gaps after decades of attention to these issues? What's actually going on and what's producing these differences? So I'm going to summarize two sort of streams in my work that help uncover some of these explanations for why. So the first we're going to think about is evaluations of people, right? So we're all being evaluated all of the time. We're evaluated when we're applying for a job, applying to medical school, when we're thinking about promotion and applying for a promotional position within our firm. We're being evaluated informally by our colleagues who are deciding who should be on this task force dealing with this issue, who's going to be selected for these opportunities. So one way that we see inequality being produced is in those direct evaluations that happen at work all of the time. The second way that inequality is produced has to do with pipelines. What are the things that are driving people to sort into different types of opportunities, right? To be evaluated for a position, you have to be in the population or pool of people who's in the consideration set. What are some of the things that are driving men and women in particular to sort into different types of opportunities? So I'm going to taking each of these in turn as a way of unpacking this question of why. And I should mention, if anyone has a clarification question or wants to raise their hand throughout, feel free. We will also leave about 15 minutes at the end, maybe even a little bit more for questions as well. So let's start with this idea of evaluations, right? People being evaluated and how that produces inequality. When we think about evaluations, I mentioned some of the formal ways people are evaluated, right? We have performance reviews. Someone is taking a look at all of the things that you're doing and trying to assess whether you get a top rating or whether you get not the 5, but the 4 instead. So when we think about these evaluations, my work has revealed two different ways. It's revealed many different ways. We're going to focus on two today for how these evaluations produce inequality. And specifically, we're going to think about how the conditions that the decision maker, right, the person who's in charge of doing the evaluating, the conditions facing that individual can actually magnify inequality in ways that are not just about bias. So a lot about what we're going to be thinking about here is what are the structural ways that we design these systems that put decision makers in a position that makes it more likely that they pay attention to a person's gender and not just the objective information about their actual performance, the things that should matter. And the first of these has to do with the size of the candidate pools that these decision makers are considering. So I want you to imagine that for an opportunity, maybe a promotion, a hiring manager or a manager of an upcoming team has 4 candidates that they're considering. If you have 4 candidates, that individual can go in and pay attention to each of those individuals, read their credentials, read their statements, gather information that's objective to make a decision. Now, what do we think happens when we increase the size of that pool? Where now you don't have 4 individuals, but you have 12, or maybe even more than 12. As we start increasing the size of these pools, And let me tell you, when we're thinking about some of these tech companies, we have hiring managers that are considering pools of 500, 800 applicants. So this is a small scale example here. What do you think happens as we increase the size of the pool? What happens to that manager? Can they now pay attention to each of those individuals and all of their different characteristics and go under the hood and figure out what they've done? No. So what ends up happening when we increase the size of the pool is that managers or decision makers more generally are left to rely on shortcuts. So now I want to walk through how gender, and we can substitute race or ethnicity in here too, becomes one of these shortcuts. We have all of these beliefs that are associated with gender. Rightfully or wrongfully, we're going to sort of set that aside for a moment, but there are beliefs that women have historically not been represented in STEM. So if I'm looking at a pool of 500 candidates for a job that is STEM heavy, that requires mathematical or analytical skills, and I can't pay attention to each one of those candidates, what do? I start to rely on gender as a sorting mechanism or a heuristic to help winnow down that pool. So maybe I keep the woman in the pool who has the highest credentialing, but I discount the vast majority of those women because I make the assumption that women are on average not going to be as strong in those fields. I don't have to have bias from the perspective of a taste-based preference for men. It's not that I don't like women or I don't want to work with women. It's that I'm now cognitively taxed and trying to make a decision under constraints where I have a fixed amount of time and I need to sort through, so I start to use these shortcuts. So in a lot of my research, I'm finding that as that pool expands, we see gendered patterns emerging across different types of evaluations, where men get an advantage and all else equal, equally qualified women are disadvantaged. The most fascinating thing is we sometimes have the same exact evaluator making decisions under non-constraint, small pools, and constraint, large pools, and that same person will not exhibit a gender difference when they have a small pool, but they will when they have a larger pool. So it starts to tell us that there's something to this heuristic that shows up and sort of presents in making these decisions. Next sort of structural component I want to think through here. Sometimes we're making decisions for ourselves. I'm deciding who I'm going to hire or who I'm going to choose to work on a project with. Other times I'm in a position where I'm making a choice for someone else. For example, for a client, thinking about who is the best suited individual to work with this client outside of the firm, who maybe I don't know that well. So let me show you how this tends to play out. Have myself there at the center, and I'm deciding between two individuals who I work with to staff onto a prestigious project that is going to be someone who's working directly with me. Often what we find is parity. There isn't a systematic gender difference when people are making these decisions for themselves. I'm equally likely to hire the woman as I am the man. Now let's imagine that we have the same person and they're considering someone else. They're thinking about my client who I need to make sure that I satisfy. Or maybe I'm an HR manager and I'm thinking about who is the actual hiring manager who's going to work with this person. What do you think happens here? Do you think we see parity when we're thinking about other people? We don't. In situations where we're considering the preferences of others, we see a systematic pattern towards inequality, where the woman is no longer favored in the same way that the male candidate is, but instead, the male is disproportionately selected. And what I do in my work is sort of unpack the why. And it comes down to, in moments when we're making decisions for other people, we often don't have perfect information on that person's preference. So what do we know about stereotypes? By definition, it means that most people hold these beliefs. So even if I'm not biased, or I don't have a preference for working with with a male candidate, when I'm thinking about that client in a professional setting where we probably haven't had a powwow to talk about how do you feel about working with women versus not, I'm left to make assumptions. So when I'm starting to consider this outside client, it's much more likely that even if I myself don't act in a biased way or don't show a preference for men over women, I assume that that client may hold those biases. And if you sort of think about it, there's no cost to choosing the man and having that outside client not be biased. But if you get it wrong and that client actually prefers to work with a man, but you send over a female candidate, there's a cost there. So it's sort of the risk-averse practice of, in a world where I can't know definitively what other people's preferences are, I'm likely to do what feels like the safer thing, which is select the male candidate. And this shows up the most in male-dominated fields. Because in male-dominated fields, we know that by definition, men have historically been most represented. So it's even more likely that those preferences or biases exist among others. So when we're thinking about recommending somebody in nursing, we might not see this as much. But when we're thinking about recommending someone in a surgical field, we're going to see the male preference show up even more. Yeah.
You mentioned nursing. So because nursing is female dominated, does the same principle apply in that they prefer female candidates even though a male candidate might be more qualified?
We don't see the reverse pattern.
Interesting.
So in my work, so full disclosure, my work so far has not compared nursing specifically, but I'm familiar with other work that has. So in my work, I look at men and women who are decision makers who are connecting directly with men and women across all kinds of fields, from the most female typed to the most male typed. We don't see gender differences no matter how male typed it is. When we have the preferences of others in mind, meaning I'm referring someone to you, I'm connecting them to you, we see this pattern of female disadvantage when it's male typed, but we don't see the reverse. We see parity when it's female typed. So yeah, we don't see, it's not symmetrical. And that gets a little bit at, if it were symmetrical, what would be a conclusion of that? It's happening on both sides. We can call it discrimination and reverse discrimination. But in fact, what we're seeing is no better than equity, but than a female disadvantage. So that's a great question. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm wondering if there's a difference if the hiring manager is hiring on behalf of a female or on behalf of a male. If they're hiring on behalf of a female, is that discrimination diminished?
So that's a great question. It's actually ongoing work that I'm doing right now. So in the studies that I've done so far, I haven't been able to tease that apart. But it's something that I'm thinking about next, where if I'm making that connection for a man or a woman, does it differ? My prior is that it won't differ as much as we think it will, but that's TBD. Yeah. Yeah, great questions. Yes, please feel free to continue as we go through. Okay, so I told you the first thing we're going to think about is, when do evaluations become more unequal? And essentially pointing to the idea of candidate pool size matters, and when we're structuring decisions, being really clear on the potential consequences of having those decisions be made by one person when they have to have someone else in mind. And you can start to see how part of what I'm focused on here is, how do we create structural changes as opposed to debiasing strategies, right? So think about most of the work that's been done so far. We have this idea that people are biased, and we're going to go in and we're going to teach them to be less biased. How effective has that been? Not really, right? So a lot of what I think about in my work is, first, I don't think it's all bias. I don't think we have a bunch of people running around who are just trying to disadvantage women willy-nilly and are just out there to get the women. I don't actually believe that to be the primary thing that's going on. I think we create structural opportunities for us to rely on these baseline assumptions and these patterns that we know to be true. And when they get activated, we start to see this inequality. So what my work starts to point at are, what are some of the structural changes we can do that are not monumental, like tear everything down and start over, but can we start making candidate pools a little bit smaller, right? Something I think about now. Think about this when I'm structuring decision making. Is there an opportunity? Are we being penny wise and dollar foolish? We want to have one evaluator make all the choices because it's more efficient. But is it really, if part of what we're trying to be efficient about is being equitable as well? So we'll say more about that in a little bit, but that's the kind of framework that I have in mind. So now let's shift to the other side of this question of, how does inequality get reproduced and what are the drivers? And thinking about the design and sort of structuring of candidate pools. Who is opting in to different opportunities and what is sort of driving some of those changes that we see? So when we think about opting into opportunities, we know that not all people pursue all opportunities in equal measure. And specifically, we know that there are some gendered and racialized patterns to how people decide which opportunities they will pursue. And I want to put the caveat out there that what I'm about to share with you is not saying that some essentialist explanation of women are just doing things differently and we need to change the women. you're going to see it still comes from this perspective of we know inequality exists. So anticipating those kinds of inequities is a big part of the reason that we see the kind of sorting that we see, right? So it's more, again, fix the system, not fix the individual. So let's start with this first one about how people pursue differently when they anticipate unfairness. So let's imagine that we have a female candidate, and this female candidate is considering a job, for all intents and purposes, the same exact job being offered by two organizations. They're like, do I apply for or pursue organization one versus organization two? Now let's imagine that unlike organization one, organization two has a few features that stand out. The candidate can see that there are women in leadership. Women have been successful here. Maybe the company is even founded by a female team. Not only that, but company two is also saying, we value fairness and equity. We're a place that wants to help everyone succeed. Not even DEI claims per se, but just we're a place that values fairness. What do you think our female candidate chooses if she's opting between the two? Two. So what we find in our work is that women are much more likely to pursue and ultimately accept offers from organizations that signal fairness and equity. And the reason for this is that we're all working and operating in a world where we know that inequity exists. So the baseline expectation is that without other information, I'm at risk of experiencing unfairness here. So when organizations send signals that no, we're not like everyone else. We actually value fairness and we put our money where our mouth is. Maybe they actually signal the ways that they value fairness and the steps that they've taken. We see female candidates being much more likely to soar into those opportunities than others. Again, all else equal. The next one has to do with uncertainty about success, right? So there's a ton of research that tells us that women don't pursue opportunities at the same rate that men do, and specifically that they don't pursue promotional opportunities. So not just sorting into the company in the first place, but conditional on being in a specific career or occupation, that they're not raising their hand or putting their name in the ring for opportunities that are promotional. And this is research that since at the time I was a grad student sort of troubled me because there was no good explanation for why. It's like we observed this pattern, but no one could really tell me why this is the case, why this is happening. So I ran some studies that help us understand how overcoming this might come from gaining experience. So is it the case that as women gain experience, right? So we have super early career, someone with very little experience, and then looking at them at mid-career and later career, is it really true that women don't put their name in the ring at all career stages, or is this more of a rookie early career phenomenon? And essentially, this is what I find. I find that very early in people's careers, so some of this work is in politics, so think about running for office, sort of a higher ranking office. Very early in women's careers, they are much less likely to throw their name in, to be willing to be promoted, to consider an opportunity. But as we get to, and our study is actually about 9 years of experience, as we get to somewhere around that mid-career point, we see that gap close. And in some instances, we even see a reversal. This is a stylized example here. I have the reversal small because it varies quite a bit. But in some cases, we even see women being more likely than men in later career, excuse me, to put their name in the ring than the men would be with equal levels of experience. So what does this tell us? It's fascinating because in our studies, both men and women recognize that they're probably not ready when they're down here. It's not that women are uniquely feeling underprepared. The men feel underprepared too, but they do it anyway. So what do we take away from this? One way is maybe we need to temper. Maybe men are doing things too soon sometimes. So there's one piece of this, which is maybe tempering when you feel not ready. For maybe everyone is actually not ready down here. And we don't necessarily need the women stepping up. We need everybody to like wait their turn, gain a little bit more experience to be prepared for those roles. But we also need to help women have more clarity about what it means to be successful. So when we run some follow-up studies, what we find is that the reason why women are less likely to run is because they worry they're not going to be successful. So both men and women know they may be underqualified, but the next piece that's unique to the women is that they're like, but because I'm underqualified, I'm not going to succeed here. So we can think about a whole host of ways that we can help clarify the parameters for success. What does it actually take to be successful here? To remove some of that uncertainty and to help close this gap, maybe the appropriate place is somewhere down here. You don't need to wait until you have that much experience, Lisa.
of the microphone. I'm just wondering how much family planning has to do with this. So early on, women may not grab at opportunities because they're anticipating that they're going to have to take more time off than men.
Yeah, so we do across the studies several different things to look at this. So really early career, pre-kids. So we have some studies, people just after college, and we see these patterns emerge before a period that most people are thinking about family planning. The gap takes even longer than most people in some of these studies than most people have already had kids. So even women who have children and are older children, if they're still more junior, they still wait. So it seems to be robust beyond that, but I don't doubt that that's a part of it. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. And it reminds me of this very interesting publication in Nature just a couple of months ago, where they look at the longevity of scientists in the biomedical field and also in mathematics and physics, and they compare gender. And in the biomedical field, yes, men were more they had a longer longevity than women. But in the physical and mathematics, no. That's very interesting because they are women are so few in these areas. That's my interpretation, my personal interpretation, and they are so stubborn to be there, right? That no matter what, they will remain.
Yeah, and I mean, I think one possibility is, sorry, so I haven't seen this paper yet, so I'll have to take a look. If one interpretation is, in fact, that they have this kind of like persistence that they push forward anyway. There's the other interpretation is if they did face all of those evaluative biases that we talked about that make it a little bit harder at every stage, the women who get through are actually the best of the best. And at the end of the day, like in a lot of my work, what I find is when these gaps close is when we look at women who are in the top decile. So when you're a star performer, you tend to be evaluated similarly to the average male. But it takes being a star performer for that to be the case. So it is fascinating. I think all of those things are at play for sure, and I'll have to look at that study. I'm not familiar with it. But I saw one more hand. Was there another question? Okay. All right, so let's take a couple of minutes now, because what I want to stress is this idea that I highlighted at the beginning. I think the reason why a lot of scholars have not thought so much about the sorting into, right, the selection or differential selection into opportunities by men and women, because the naive interpretation really is some kind of women, what is it, men are from Mars, women are from Venus, or vice versa. Not a philosophy that I subscribe to. A lot of what we find in our work is that the reason why women make these different choices are because they're constrained choice. Maybe it's because they're thinking about family responsibilities, right? Primarily in many households, even in a household where my husband is admittedly an equal parent. He's out in Chicago doing touristy things with the kids while I'm here working. We've moved from my career multiple times, and he's been happy to find either move internally or otherwise. I still carry more of the load for the kids, and it's not his fault. It's this programming that I feel like I'm the one who needs to be responsible for making the call to my daughter's doctor to get the form for her trip next week on my ride up here. And again, he would do it, but I just think of it and I do it first. So there are a whole host of visible and invisible reasons that are what are these constrained choices I'm describing that could be driving some of these patterns. The key thing I want to make sure we're clear on is it's not the case that I think women just don't value their careers or are not putting their name in the ring because they're like, I'm not driven enough to do this. It's that there's awareness. I might face inequality. I'm going to have to be primarily responsible for kids that I have or that I might have. So there are all these additional factors that are playing in. So again, thinking about what we do about this, it still means that there are structural decisions and structural shifts that we can make to help get to equality by modifying the way we approach things. And that's what I want to walk through next. So I started off with this question of why inequalities emerge. And I think we've covered a couple of different reasons or different mechanisms or processes that tend to drive differences that we commonly observe. But what I really want to think about is what do we do about it? And my takeaway, or the takeaway I hope to leave you with today, is that there are simple and pragmatic things we can do in how we design practices and processes that help to address some of these things, not fully and not perfectly, but in pretty low-cost ways. So starting with the first half, which is this evaluation of people, the larger pools example is where we started. How do we make those pools smaller? How do we make the tax on decision makers and managers just a little bit lower so that they can pay attention to the details, So that unbiased manager who actually wants to make a fair and objective decision and find the best candidate is skilled and has the appropriate design to be able to do that. And a lot of the time, that's where we are, is we have managers who want to do the right thing, but they simply are facing constraints that make it harder to do the right thing. Efficiency kicks in, and they just aren't able to do it quite as well. So that's one lever we can think about. Very related to this, time constraints. So even when you have small pools, if you're trying to have someone make a decision in 5 minutes, they're going to use those same heuristics that we just talked about because they're constrained in a different way. So how do we create the space? Candidate pools, amount of time, you get the idea, right? Giving enough resources, et cetera. The second piece is the more we can formalize our decisions to take some of the subjectivity out and create metrics that are quantifiable, the closer we get. And that's, of course, with the caveat that formalization can actually entrench inequality. If you're saying that, for example, a historic example is a race-based example. If we know that racial minorities have struggled to get adequate test preparation, so they tend to perform lower on a test, and we make the metric for hiring somebody that they have to score above a threshold on that test that is harder to access for Black students, we're going to reinstate inequality. So we have to be careful about what those metrics actually are, and that we're actually prioritizing things that matter. Does that test score actually matter for predicting that the person will be great with patients? And if the answer is no, do we need to rely on that test metric, or is there a different metric we should be thinking about? So formalizing processes that rely on metrics that matter the most for the outcomes that we care about, so that we can make the decision simpler for the person who is sorting through those 500 resumes and trying to figure out who to select and who is going to be in the short list versus not. On the flip side, when we think about people pursuing opportunities, we talk a lot about wanting to fix our pipelines, right? We say it takes a candidate. We can't hire more women if they're simply not in the running for opportunities. If we just stop there, we conclude women need to do something differently. Women need to apply. Women need to raise their hand. They need to self-advocate. And to all the women in the room, I say you do and you should. Right? It's not that we don't need to do those things. But as program designers, we should be thinking about how do we create the conditions that facilitate women engaging in that way? What are some of the barriers that might be baked in that we take for granted that make it less likely that the equally qualified female candidate doesn't raise her hand, doesn't say that she's interested in the position? So 2 things that we talked about today is, can we increase transparency about fairness? Transparency about how we make decisions. When you arrive here, you're going to be evaluated. Here are the metrics that matter. You're going to have the mentorship that you need to be able to achieve that. Look at this role model who's successfully navigated the system. There's somebody you should be looking to as a model for how to do this. It becomes clear that I can be successful here and that this is an organization that actually values and prioritizes fairness in my success, to start chipping away at those barriers we talked about, to have women seek out the opportunities in the first place, and then to be comfortable and willing to climb the ladder once they do. So with that, I'm sharing here this QR code, which brings you to a page on my website that has links to many of the papers that I cited here if you're interested. I'm glad to say that we have about 20 minutes for questions, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you for this great talk. One of the things that companies are, and not just companies, but academia, it costs, right? And so when you're looking at reducing the pool from, and I'll just make an example, our application pool was over 16,000 for 200
spots. So 500
spots.
Sounds like nothing.
Yeah, 500 sounds like. Anyway, the push going forward, right, is to use AI. But how do you use AI without repeating all of the biases that you just talked about?
Yeah, so it's kind of like a marrying, the great question. Thank you for that. It's a bit of a marrying of the 2 sides that I talked about. On the one hand, we want to formalize processes, because by formalizing processes, you can actually train a model to be able to make some of those selection choices. So what's a version of training the model that could reproduce biases? If we train the model to say that you need to have, and I'll be honest, I don't know, is this medical school applicants, what the MCAT scores are, like what the thresholds are now. But let's imagine that I'll go back to my old days in SATs. There you say you have to have over 1400 on the SAT to be qualified. But if we know from our data that historically some populations have been less successful at achieving those scores, not because they're less qualified in the end, they end up being great in their fields, but simply because they don't on average have the same resources to be able to do the test prep. We all know that test prep will take our scores from one decile to another pretty quickly. As a first-gen college student, I did not have access to test prep. So this feels very close to home. So when you know that that's something that's been a disadvantage for a population of students that you want to be able to bring into the fold, you can't train the model to select on that. So how can you actually create a set of specifications or criteria that closely align with what is desired for the job, what makes a great medical student, but doesn't systematically disadvantage one category over another? And that's a very sort of field-specific thing. There isn't a one-size-fits-all answer, but that's the mental model that I think we have to have in mind to be able to rely on AI to do the first cut. Because let's be honest, of those 16,000 applicants, probably a vast majority of them are not qualified to be considered really. So you want to use it for that filtering to then create smaller pools that you can go in and do a deep dive to say, this candidate may not be quite at this level, but look at these other elements that make them a great candidate. It's worth a second look, especially if they're from an underrepresented group. Yeah, it's a tricky problem to solve. And the reality is, I think each field has to be really clear about what those criteria are, and they're going to vary a ton across. Yeah.
With medicine, with metrics, that there does be a threshold effect. So basically, once you're over the threshold, it's not so predictive. But there is a threshold below
which yeah. Yeah, so the comment was in medicine, there's a threshold effect from the perspective of if you're below a certain threshold, it's likely that you're not going to be successful. But then if you're above it, the differentiation between maybe that level and the top isn't that great. So then just being clear about that maybe the first filtering metric is to say, we need a score. What is the throw threshold out at me?
The problem is we actually, and not just us, but you look at all medical schools. You look at all medical schools, the best predictor, first of all, metrics aren't a great predictor, but it's better if you combine both grades and MCAT. So standardized test plus grades.
Right.
It's slightly better. And so, yeah, so basically, something above, a little bit above 50 percentile in terms of the standardized and, like a 3.7 GPA, something on that order.
Yeah, so if I were designing a system, I'd start with that. And I'd say, if we know that, so the 50th percentile is quite low, right? And often when we're thinking about the actual metrics that get used is we know the people who have parents who've been in medicine before, who kind of know how to work the system, are more likely to score in the upper deciles than they are closer to the average. So what ends up happening is we reproduce what we already have. We end up with people who look a lot like the people who are already here when we rely on those thresholds. But you just gave a great answer. If we know that a 3.7 and 50th percent is some baseline that is sufficient enough to sort out a bottom part that's kind of what cuts it down to maybe it's 8,000 or 4,000 candidates. Now you have a much more workable pool to start digging into than you did at the beginning without risking opting out people who could be great just because they're from a marginalized background. Yeah, CJ.
I've got a question from the chat here. It says, my understanding has always been that a larger pool tends to allow for a more diverse candidate pool, especially as women and other minoritized populations are more likely to have more unusual backgrounds, and a smaller pool is more likely to exclude them. How do these things balance out?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I don't think we want to restrict the pool, right? So the way I would think about this is we want lots of people to apply. We want to be able to sort of access. So for us in academia, for example, we're always thinking about if we're recruiting a rookie faculty member, we don't want to just go to the elite PhD programs, because what happens there? Access to the elite PhD programs is itself gendered and even more so racialized. So we want to broaden that pool. What we want to do is broaden the pool, but then create systems like the ones we were just describing that filter that pool and don't ask a single person to have to look at 2,000 applicants, because that's where it becomes unreasonable. So it's creating systems that make the pool any given decision makers looking at more manageable while still trying to source and get access to a large population of applicants. And then the cost piece, of course, right? Then thinking about how to balance that with cost.
This was really interesting. Some of the research that I've looked at on studying team performance suggests that women are actually much better at working together on teams than men are, and men tend to be more individualistic and wanting individual recognition. And often this leads to men getting recognized more often than women because the team is harder to recognize than the individual performance. And that this also leads, it sort of helps train men to be more competitive and to ask for more. We were talking about this a few years ago in the PA class, the physician assistant class, and we did a little experiment by I would describe positions to the students who were graduating and just saying, here's a job. I'll describe the job exactly, and then everybody take out a blank sheet of paper and write down what salary you would expect to get for this job or what salary you would ask for. And then we gathered them all together, and generally the women asked for much less than the men asked for the same position. What are your thoughts? Are we somehow training this or ingraining this kind of behavior as well?
Yeah, I have so many thoughts. I'll try to truncate them to a couple of things. So great series of points that you're raising. So the first, I want to sort of put a label on what you just described about women being better on teams and men being more individualistic. So when we think about gender stereotypes, they basically call or sort of label men as being more agentic, meaning that they're going to self-advocate, they're going to have this more like drive for individual success, and women being more communal, right? Warmth and communality are what are associated with women. What's really fascinating about these stereotypes is that they're not just descriptive. They're not just telling us how men and women tend to behave. They're also prescriptive. They start to specify what I should do if I'm a woman, what is expected of me, and what do I need to enact to be successful here. So I said I teach a course on power, influence, and networking. My female MBA students, who are arguably among the more agentic of the set, they still sit in the room and they say, but how can I assert myself? Because what people expect from me is that I'm going to be looking out for the team and not looking out for myself. What do you think my answer to them is? Go out and do it. At the end of the day, it's the how you do it that's important. But the message we need to be telling women is you're asking for too little when you're posting the salary. And I hope that you show that data. Do you share with them? Yeah, right. So that's the best we can do is to start tearing these things down is to say, look, here we have a room filled of equally qualified PA students who are going to go into the field, and you're going to anchor on a low number because you're conforming to the gender stereotypes that exist. But by creating awareness that all the men in the room ask for something more, or on average, the men in the room ask for something more, you start to correct that narrative so that those women go out and now know, I need to up the ante by 15% or 20% or whatever the gap is. So a lot of it is rewriting what those prescriptions are. And I think we have opportunities to do that in the classroom. Yeah, it's a great question. And I love that you do that. Yeah, in the back here. Oh, sorry.
Just so you know, there's also. Yeah, do you want to ask that question while I hand off the mic?
I've got a couple questions from the chat here, but just one. The first one was, is it true that the fear of failure when trying for a position where a woman feels underqualified is a huge impediment to applying? If the woman fails, it isn't looked at as an individual failure as it would for a man, but as a reflection of women or a representative group. If true, how can we overcome that mindset in the public or in a systemic way?
Okay, so yes, so there's research from some colleagues of mine at the London Business School in particular who've looked at specifically looking at women's response to rejection. So I'll say this, which is a more individualistic answer, and I'll come back to the second point. From an individual perspective, if I've applied, what this research shows, if I've applied for a job and I'm not selected, I'm significantly less likely to apply the next time with that same employer or to work with that same headhunter. But the man does it anyway. Right? He was rejected before. It's kind of rolls off your back and you go on again. My individual sort of recommendation to that is you should do it anyway, because there's a sense of, because I was rejected, it's an affront against me as an individual, so I don't do it again. But in reality, that organization, that headhunter, it probably had nothing to do with you. Think about all the heuristics I was just telling you about. If it's true that they're doing some kind of filtering, they probably don't even remember, recognize, didn't think about your qualifications as closely as you think they did. So we need to push back against that for ourselves. The idea that women are more communal sort of ties into why we might believe that part of why we hesitate is that it's a reflection of womankind. I certainly don't feel that way. So I think that on average, that's not as likely. I don't know of research that speaks to it directly. It's a big assumption to say that because I failed in one endeavor, it's a reflection of all women. I think that's a bold thing to assume. So I would say just to kind of tear that down if that's a mental model that you're holding or that this person is holding, as much as you can. I don't know of work that tells us specifically how likely that is, though, to speak to it more specifically. There's a question back here.
Okay, so thank you for your talk. Regarding, asking for more, I'm in favor of that as well. But I'm wondering if you can speak to sort of sometimes the response that garners from that organization or from leadership. That I think there's a penalty for women who ask more that doesn't exist for men.
Yeah.
Right. And then there is a performance expectation sometimes that's imposed on women who ask for more that isn't imposed on men that ask for that same amount. And so what can institutions or organizations do to rectify that from a, systemic and structural point of view?
Yeah, one of the biggest challenges, I think, is the idea of pay secrecy that is so true in this country, right? So it is taboo to talk about how much you make with your coworkers. So often you don't know. And I'll give a quick side story about my very first job before I got my PhD. I get a 40% raise about 2 years in. And how do I interpret this? I'm like, wow, I'm amazing. I got this huge raise. Like they're really recognizing me for my contributions. I then have a senior VP, and this story is actually part of what motivated me to go back to school and to study what I study, who called me aside and said, "Dear, you got a 40% raise. Like you are amazing, but that's not why. We were correcting salaries. You were the only person we hired that year I was an actuary at the time, into this class who didn't negotiate." And thinking back on that, it feels almost comical to me. I told you I was a first gen, so it kind of makes sense. I didn't have this anchoring of like setting expectations of what I should be asking for. I've negotiated every job and gotten what I wanted since then, but I didn't at the time. So this idea of pay secrecy makes it really hard because I had no idea that I was making as much less as I was. And I was lucky to work for an employer and for a manager who did something to correct that. At the end of the day, gathering data, and again, we can't often ask our coworkers, but if you go in with an informed perspective where you know that people who have your qualifications and your geographical region, and there are tons of platforms out there that help us do this now. So you're coming from a data-backed perspective and from a place that's not hyper emotional. That lands much better than if you go in and just say, I think I'm being underpaid, and you don't have any sort of justification for it and you seem kind of frustrated and frazzled about it. That tends to get a much less positive response. And in reality, that's what most men are doing. So most men are going in and just being firm about what they need. It's not sort of an accusatory, like, oh, because you're undervaluing me, or sort of pointing fingers at anyone. It's not coming from an aggressive place. It's just a fact-based, this is what I think I deserve. I'd like to stay with the employer. Even better if you have an outside option, right? So what do? Go out and sort of seek out, test the market. And if you have an outside option, use that for leverage. Then you have something to sort of really back it up. But even without that, I think just being as fact-based as you can is the best way about it. Yeah. The mic is going to trip us up the whole afternoon.
Done. How do you then deal? So I'm an advanced practice nurse, and as there's subspecialty underneath that.
Mhm.
Much like physicians have subspecialty that are all paid very differently.
Mhm.
How do you handle being undervalued as you're trying to negotiate and you know the value you ought to be getting, but because the data is actually not provided properly, where the offers is just nothing matches.
Mhm.
So your value, you ought to be getting more, other subspecialties get paid significantly higher than your subspecialty with much higher site costs that I will have than other advanced practice nurse professions.
So it's a great question. So I'll say caveat that it's trickier from the individual perspective to navigate it. Maybe I'll come back to the earlier question of what can organizations do. So what we know is that the labor market in any industry and field is gendered. And what ends up happening, there's some wonderful work by a woman named Paula England, where she's basically dug into the devaluation of women's work. And what she basically finds is that we will have women disproportionately in some subfields, that they become female typed just because women have sorted into those subfields. But the qualifications necessary to do that work is no less than the qualifications to do some other type of work, but it gets labeled differently and then associated with lower pay. And that's basically what you're describing. I don't know if you're seeing gendered patterns in these subfields. Yeah. So this is a very common, so across every field and industry. And over the years, because women's work has historically been devalued, specialties or areas that are dominated by women tend to be associated with lower pay, even when what it takes to do the work there is just as demanding, requires just as much credentialing. Everything else is pretty equal. So as organizations, what we should be doing is not siloing in this way and taking a step back and valuing work differently to think about what is required to be an expert in this space. Is it different from this other space? And if the answer is no, and the salaries are not equal, what can we do to adjust and correct? There have been organizations that up the female type specialties. There are organizations that up female and lower male to create some equity. And there are all different ways to address it. But a systematic, like organization level response is the most effective, because what happens to individuals is I go in and I say, but I don't know enough about the field. So I'm in specialty A and I don't make this much, but my colleague in specialty B does. The organization will say, yeah, but they're different. And they'll just kind of give a hand wavy response to it. So from an organizational perspective, if we can remedy that and create more equity across, it makes it a lot easier. It's very hard for individuals to solve that. Yeah. Frustrating answer, but unfortunately the reality. So your question back here. Oh, up here. Oh, got it. It's out of my view a little bit. Sorry. Yeah.
So I have two questions. I guess you're talking mostly about America.
So I'll admit my work is largely in the US and in the UK a little bit.
So are there any differences between countries that have less bias? And if so, what do they do, or do you know? And secondly, if you look historically where we were and where we are now, can you project to a time that this bias will disappear?
Those are two hard. So the first question, there is variation. A lot of the countries that we see as most equitable are places like Denmark and Switzerland and Sweden. So a completely different sort of infrastructure in the way they kind of think about pay in general. Many of the countries who operate similar to the US have similar levels of inequality. So unfortunately, there isn't a lot of like adopt what we see over here and apply it here. That is a one size fits all kind of solution. In terms of projecting, full transparency, if you asked me this question 5 years ago, I thought we were on a slow but clear upward trajectory. This moment feels like the hardest to be doing this kind of work. It also feels like the most important moment to be doing this kind of work. And it's less clear to me that we continue to be on an upward trajectory. So I don't know. I'm a little bit less hopeful than I was when I first started.
Administration.
I mean, in mixed audiences that I don't know well, I don't make assumptions about anyone's political views, but maybe. I'm sorry that I didn't see your hand before.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just wanted to ask real quick about the survivorship bias of the people who make it to those higher levels of leadership, and with regards to the mentorship that you were talking about, because I think about how and this has been well described, and that female CEOs, female heads of nonprofits, female politicians that can become heads of state notoriously tend to have certain character traits that even are perceived more masculine. That's a big part of why they potentially succeed. In the political world, I have friends who have told me this, and I didn't believe them, but I think I believe it now, that the first American woman president will probably be a conservative, right? Just because of that's just what the country will reward. And I'm just wondering the kind of effect that could potentially have on young people who do want to break in, when they look at who their potential mentors would be, and they're like, well, I don't really like my mentor, the person who would be my mentor, so I don't want to go down that path.
Yeah, I think I hear this often from my female MBA students, especially those that, and I've now been teaching for 10 years. So those that were in my class in the early days, and some of them have exited and have come back to me to sort of talk about the why, it is really difficult when you look to role models and you can't identify the person that you aspire to be. And what you're describing is, to date, a disproportionate share of the underrepresented minorities and women who are in elite positions are people that many junior folks look at and say, but I don't want to be that, right? That's not a model of how I want to operate and how I want to exist. So I think that's tricky. The flip side of that, though, is that the path to making some progress? Unfortunately, I think it is, right? Like, Kamala Harris was never going to win the election this past election, right? We were not ready to have a racial minority female leader who's liberal. Does it mean it has to be a conservative? No, but we probably can't check all the boxes that we would like to in making change. So slow and steady progress, my answer to the question from earlier, slow and steady progress might mean chipping one thing at a time and sort of constraining what that looks like, with hope that fast forward 10, 15, maybe 50 years, we are in a place where we have the openness and the willingness to accept a really radical change in terms of what leadership looks like. I don't think we're there today. I definitely don't think we're there today in terms of the political sphere, unfortunately.
Okay, well, fantastic questions. Thank you to the audience, both in person and online, for all of that. And especially thank you to Dr. Abraham for a very thoughtful talk. It fit perfectly with our theme this year. And you can see we don't get to talk to many business school faculty very often.
No, I love it. This is great.
These are all really pertinent questions, but we're all focused on cellular and molecular and this and that.
So I love it. And also, I mean, as an educator, a person who really cares about disseminating the work into broader audiences who are out there making the changes and making the decisions, this was a really fortunate opportunity for me to get to do this and have even a small impact on the way people in medicine and in science more generally are thinking about these issues. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a round of applause. We really appreciate you joining us today and staying for this 10th anniversary reception. I hope many of you can stay. And if you haven't had some heavy hors d'oeuvres for lunch, please feel free to help yourself. There's a PowerPoint that we were going to put on.
I was trying to see if I could help with that, but I can't.
Oh, okay.
Is it just the next slide? Okay.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so we'll take about a 5-minute break, and then Susie and I have just a very brief few words to say about the last 10 years.
So we'll take a break now. Thank you so much.